Welcome to the Red Path. Hello and welcome back to the Red Path. Today we're going to look at the latest Imperial Armour Compendium. This was recently released and discussed on another channel, Sprues and Brews. The link for that channel will be found in the description below. Please visit and give them a like and subscribe because that channel released this information. I am just using information available from their release and giving my thoughts and commentary on it here. I'm going to post screenshots of the data sheets on the screen and give my thoughts for each individual unit. I'm focusing on units that I personally have used or am familiar with. I will then post the points values afterwards. There will be timestamps below in the description for each individual unit, so you can skip ahead if you're just here to check out a datasheet or two. Several datasheets that I'm not familiar with or will never use, for instance the Thunderhawk, will just be cycled through at the end. And again, there will be timestamps below, so if you're just looking for a piece of information, you can skip ahead to that. Okay, without further ado, let's crack on and start looking at some of these new data sheets. So first we're going to look at the Dreadnoughts, the Deredeo, the Contemptor and the Leviathan. On the screen should be the Deredeo and the Contemptor data sheets. The biggest changes to the Deredeo are the weapons description changes. So the Butcher Cannon is now replaced with the Anvilus Autocannon, bringing it more in line with the Loyalist version. Looks like it's lost a point of strength and no longer affects enemy morale, which to be fair was never a game changer anyway. And the Great Havoc launcher is now the Aeolus missile launcher. The Great Havoc was pretty useful because it ignored line of sight, which is something Chaos Space Marines don't have too much access to. Overall, I don't think the Deredeo is going to see as much play anymore, especially now that it's going to cost 1 CP to actually use, which is a shame. However, it does reduce damage, something I'm expecting to see across all Chaos Dreadnoughts and Hellbrutes. Still has a 5-up invuln and a 3-up armor save. Next, looking at the Contemptor, coming down to 9 wounds is actually a buff because its stats no longer degrade. Still has a huge amount of weapons to choose from, and some of the biggest changes I can see there are the C-beam cannon or conversion beamer. Has much more clear-cut rules now with 3 range options, which is a huge improvement to the clunky previous rule set. The loss of soul burners is a shame, as there's no more mortal wound fun for combat orientated Contemptor dreads, which is a big deal in my opinion. I believe the ability to take a shoulder mounted missile launcher was included in an FAQ previously, however it's nice to see it actually on the datasheet now. In general, I think the Contemptor has come off fairly well out of this. The standardization of weapon loadouts brings us closer to Loyalist Marines, which is a shame because I like the individuality that you could get with the unique weapon choices that the Chaos Dreadnoughts, Relic Dreadnoughts had. However, it's what we've got. It's something to consider, but I don't think at the moment, without access to further stratagems and abilities, and we're also not possessing the Hellbrute keyword, it's hard to say what place the Contemptor will have in a Chaos Space Marine army. Next, let's look at the Leviathan. Now, the Leviathan never had as much of a place in Chaos Space Marine lists as it did in Loyalist Marine lists, just because we didn't have the opportunity to make it as broken as the Iron Hands, for example. However, it was a fun model to use. The biggest deal at the moment is that it has been reduced from Toughness 8 to Toughness 7, which is quite significant. The weapons again have been standardized to fit with the Loyalist version. Like with the other Relic Dreadnoughts, there is no more 4-up invulnerable in combat available for this, at least at present time. There's just a few changes here to, its stats and weapons options. Ultimately, I think both the Deredeo and Leviathan have taken hits now. Granted, their points have changed as well, but they don't feel like they used to in 8th edition, and I guess the beginning of 9th. Next, I want to look at the Whirlwind Scorpius. The Whirlwind Scorpius was one of my favourite units over the last few months for use with my World Eaters army. The ability to have Khan standing beside 1 or 2 of these, and the sheer amount of firepower they could put out, ignoring line of sight, could be quite horrifying. However, even though there's been a significant points decrease to the Scorpius, it has lost the ability to fire twice if it remains stationary. The multi-launcher hasn't changed. From what I can tell, it's still 48-inch, 3d3, strength 6, -2, damage 2, and ignores line of sight, so it's still a good weapon. However, the ability to fire twice was what made it particularly good. I may still consider it. We'll see how it balances out points-wise in the list builds I currently have. It also has the option now to take a Hunter-Killer missile, which I probably will never take, but it's an option there for you. As with all other vehicles and dreadnoughts, it does gain the smokescreen keyword, which unlocks a stratagem to pop smoke. Next, let's look at the available Land Raider variants. We have the Chaos Land Raider Proteus and the Achilles. I wasn't much of a fan of the Proteus through 8th edition. The Accursed Phylactery was, whilst a very fluffy and interesting ability, never seemed to have much use because leadership was never a big deal through 8th edition, and doesn't look like to be too much of a big deal right now in 9th. Of course, that may change. Stats wise, it looks like it's remained fairly similar. Still got toughness 8 with a 2-up save. The phylactery is now called something else, and I can't read it because of the quality of the screenshot. However, it essentially denies deep strike within 12 inches, which is actually quite a powerful option right now considering the size of a Land Raider, and I believe the Proteus is slightly larger. I don't have a Proteus Land Raider, but I believe it is larger. The footprint there, that's going to have a footprint with a circle well in excess of 24 inches in diameter, as it's a 12-inch radius from any point of the Land Raider itself, so you can deny deep strike in a huge part of the battlefield, and considering smaller battlefields, this may actually be something with some tactical versatility, something to consider. Weapons loadouts are pretty standard. It comes with 2 twin las cannons, and you can pick the top sponson position as a heavy bolter, twin heavy bolter, multi-melter, or twin heavy flamer, so you can customize it, which is actually quite nice. And again, combi bolters and hunter killers are allowed to be added. One note, as with previous edition, if you do upgrade it to have the replacement to the phylactery, it will reduce the transport to 6 infantry models. Next, let's look at the Chaos Land Raider Achilles, one of my favourite units from the last year or so. I've been running 2 of them in my competitive lists. This is unfortunately going to change. The Achilles has lost 3 wounds, down from 19 to 16. It no longer has a 4-up invuln, which was the selling point for me. Being able to throw 19 toughness 8 wounds in the centre of the board with a 4-up invulnerable was incredibly powerful, especially when you had a squad of berserkers inside just waiting to come out and kill everything within range. Also, it did have a 2d3 soul burner bombard, which shot out 2d3 shots of mortal wounds, ignoring line of sight, which was an incredibly powerful and useful weapon. This has now been replaced with a quad launcher, and whilst it has interesting statistics, is no replacement in my opinion for the soul burners, which is a huge shame. The multi-melters have been improved to the more recent datasheet entry. Instead of having 4 melter shots, it now has 8 melter shots, and they have the new damage profile of d6+2 at half range. Depending on the points, may be an option, but will no longer be as useful for the role I previously used it for competitively. Next, we're going to look at some of the larger transports. So starting off with the Chaos Spartan, not many significant changes. Looks like 20 wounds, toughness 8 with a 2-up save. No invulnerable, same as last edition, which is an incredible shame because even with a 2-up save, as a Lord of War, this thing is going to find it very difficult to hide behind line of sight blocking terrain, if at all. It's going to cost CP to take one in your list. It can take 25 infantry models and does put out a decent amount of firepower, but I just don't see it being particularly efficient. Next, I'd like to look at the Chaos Storm Eagle. This was a unit I did use for about the first half of 8th edition. Transports are very important for World Eaters, and I found this to be the most efficient form. Looks to be much the same as its 8th edition version. It's -1 to hit, it's still a true flyer, has some decent weapons options, and can take 20 infantry. Points don't look to make it very efficient at all, but it's still an option. It's something we can consider. Next, let's look at the Blood Slaughterer and the Kytan. The Blood Slaughterer has come down in points, making it a very interesting choice now. Been some minor tweaks to the data sheet. This is still a very fast and effective unit. Looks like the Imperial Harpoon has had its ability changed somewhat, given the availability of buffs to our demon engines through Lord Discordant and other things. This may become a very useful option. However, we do have a wide variety from the main codex available to us, including the Venom Crawler, Mauler Fiend, Forge Fiend. Still, I think the Blood Slaughterer may find a place, and it is an incredibly cool model. Also, let's look at the Kytan Ravager. I don't actually have a Kytan, although I've always wanted one. It's something I'll just pick up and try and do some decent hobby work on rather than play, I think. Again, this is essentially a fluffy version of a knight for us, especially with it being locked to Khorne, and the Forge World answer to the Lord of Skulls, which, I'll be honest, I cannot stand the model for. However, the Kytan looks incredibly badass. So I'm not too familiar with how it played in 8th. I'd seen it in some battle reports online and know a few people that enjoy playing it. However, it looks pretty decent. Toughness 8 with what looks like 25 wounds and a 3-up save. No invulnerable save, but with 12 inches movement, I'm guessing the point of this is to run straight up the board, smash something big, shoot something else, and then absorb a lot of firepower. Again, I don't expect to see this too often in any competitive lists, given how Lord of Wars are now treated, but we might see some play for it a bit further down the line. We're going to have to wait and see what the Chaos Space Marine Codex looks like and how we buff our demon engines. Finally, I want to talk about our drop pods, the Dreadclaw and the Kharybdis. I think this is where we actually see some relative benefits from the Forge World Imperial Armour book here. One of the major changes is going to be that according to the ability, we are allowed to deep strike with the Dreadclaw and the Kharybdis in the first turn. Now, the interactions between the datasheet ability and actual match play rules is always an interesting one, because even in the later edition codex is released in 8th edition, any type of deep striking ability technically allowed you to deep strike in the first turn, but of course the big rulebook FAQs overwrote that. So at the moment, rules as written, it appears that Chaos Space Marines now have access to a turn 1 deep strike, but this could change at any moment. We will see. Looking at the Dreadclaw first, some things I noticed straight away is that it now has no ballistic skill. Its thermal jets look to be an auto-hit weapon rather than having the pistol roll. Toughness has dropped to 6, which is significant. It was nice to have that T7 value, but I think this brings it in line with the Loyalist drop pod. 9 wounds, I believe, matches what it had previously as well. I can't really remember. I haven't played one in a while. It still has the blade struts. Currently as a World Eater, this will have 5 attacks on the charge at strength 12, AP minus 4, damage 3. Now this hitting on 4s, however, something you may want to do is put Khan the Betrayer in there with a squad of Berserkers, deep strike it, and if you get all the charges off as necessary, you'll be re-rolling those 1s, 2s and 3s. 5 attacks at damage 3 means this thing could put out some serious anti-tank firepower. It's going to be wounding most vehicles on 3s at strength 12, 2s if they're light vehicles. AP4 is going to shred through everything, and damage 3 is some pretty serious stuff. Everything else looks about the same. 10 infantry models. It can transport a Contemptor or a Hellbrute. So now let's look at the Kharybdis. I do own one of these, as well as one of the regular Dreadclaws, and I'm actually quite excited to be able to bring it out. I'm considering using it in a tournament list in a couple of weeks now. I'm going to have to do some list testing to see, but I'm strongly considering it. So luckily it does retain its toughness 8 value, which is something I was very concerned about, and it's still movement 15. Has the same abilities as the regular Dreadclaw, with technically the ability to deep strike in turn 1. It flies, so will ignore vertical distancing when moving. Distances are measured to and from the model's hull, which is interesting because it is a huge model that has an incredibly high position on the battlefield when a base is used, which technically it should be for competitive games. Biggest thing I like about the new model is the fact that instead of the previous storm launchers, the current profile allows you to get 10 crack shots off, and similar to the Dreadclaw, if you had Khan disembarking from this within 1 inch, you would get 4 rerolls on that. So 10 crack missiles, a ballistic skill of 4, you're going to hit with 5 of them. With a reroll, you'll hit with another 2 or 3. That's 8 hits. At strength 8 minus 3 damage d6, you could be taking down just about anything on the battlefield. So I think there's a strong place for this in a World Eaters list specifically. So now let's have a look at the points. On the screen should be all the points values for the current Imperial Armour. I'm going to go through some of the units I've highlighted and just list what their old points are versus the new. So let's start with the Dreadnoughts. If we start with the Contemptor, the old points for a Contemptor with 2 chain fists was 140. Currently it's 150, so a slight increase there. The old build with 2 C-beams, which was a version I used a couple of times, was 165 points. That's actually gotten down now to 150 points. Next, the Deredeo with the old version, with 2 Butcher Cannons, the Great Havoc Launcher and a Twin Heavy Bolter, was 275. Now for the same build, with obviously some changes to the weapon profiles, that's 210, quite a significant decrease actually. The Leviathan was previously about 430 points with 2 Butcher Cannon arrays. Now it's going to be, I believe, 240 or 260 points, which is a very big drop. Now there have been some other changes to the profile, the T8 to T7 for example, but that is almost half price. Next, let's look at the Blood Slaughterer. Previously this was 180 points, now it's 140. The Dreadclaw went from 130 down to 115. The Land Raider Proteus was 320, now it's about 255. The Achilles went from 308 points to 320. The Rapier Carrier with a quad heavy bolter that's firing 12 shots with the new heavy bolter profile was previously 100 points, it's now 85. The Whirlwind Scorpius was 238 down to 170, which, you know, a 68 point difference is quite significant. The Storm Eagle went from 340 down to 325, the same weapon loadout. The Spartan went from 510 to 460, as best as I can make out. The Kharybdis unfortunately went up against the grain, 350 points previously, up to 400 now. Kytan changed from 430 up to 440, a slight increase. I'll have to dig into that to see the logic behind that one. And the Brass Scorpion actually went down from 600 to 525. You should be able to make any other comparisons for other units you're interested in based on the information on the screen, but those are the ones that I'm most familiar with. Out of those, they seem to be reasonable price reductions. Without a Chaos Space Marine Codex, it's hard to tell if there'll be any synergy with any new stratagems or abilities, but it does make things like the Contemptor and the Deredeo and even the Leviathan more reasonable now. Yes, their stats have been nerfed, but they will no longer be eating up almost 25% of your points for fielding a single Leviathan in a 2,000 point game, of course. I think the big winners, as I may have mentioned before, certainly include the Blood Slaughterer, which is just incredibly points efficient now. The Dreadclaw drop pod, I think, is going to see some play at 115 points. That's very reasonably priced, and it does have some utility on the battlefield. The Land Raider variants, I think, are still too expensive, considering the Achilles especially has dropped its 4-up invulnerable. The Proteus at 255 is actually starting to tempt me a little bit. The ability to deny deep strike over such a large amount of the battlefield is very interesting, and at 255 it's right there with the regular Land Raider. The Rapier Cannon as well, with the quad heavy bolter, I think dropping down 15 points to 85 is very interesting, because that's 12 heavy bolter shots with a potential of 24 damage at 85 points. You're essentially just paying for 4 heavy bolters. This is considerably cheaper than having a Havoc squad with 4 heavy bolters for the same ballistic skill. Admittedly, there will be other differences, movement and model availability and things like that, number of total wounds and toughness, etc. But that's still, for offensive output alone, that's incredibly efficient. The Scorpius, whilst I'm incredibly disappointed, lost its double shoot. Dropping it down to 170 points certainly makes it something worth considering. Its firepower has been halved, but 170 points is a lot more reasonable, and considering I would normally take 2 of them in a list, that frees up about 120 points for me to take something else. With a bit of shenanigans, I may be able to get a Blood Slaughterer for free. The Storm Eagle dropping 15 points base is interesting. Considering how 9th is playing, I'm not entirely sure that I would use it. With smaller battlefields and much more central board engagement, I feel the need for a transport like that is less important now, considering the enemy generally needs to come towards us anyway, so our threat range is more in the centre of the table than needing to get our berserkers into the enemy lines. The Spartan would still make a nice centrepiece, but I don't see any real competitive applications for it. Similarly, the Kharybdis. I was excited as I was reading this one out. However, the increase to 400 points makes this a hard sell for me. If it was somewhere around the 315, I would certainly be considering it. Even at 350, I might give it a once over, but at 400, I think it just sits right outside the potential of being efficient. The Kytan and the Brass Scorpion are also in the same boat, taking about 20% of your total points value in a 2,000 points game. I don't see them as being competitive, but they'll certainly be fun in some fluffier games. Potentially with any buffs that are available to us with a Chaos Space Marine Codex and how they may affect Lords of War and Demons and Demon Engines. There was some play during 8th for triple Lord of Skulls lists, and I know there were some variants with triple Kytans, but I think the Lord of Skulls was generally more efficient. This was mostly due to the Vigilus specialist attachments. However, we may see more of the same during 9th edition. That just remains to be seen. Okay, so I'm going to finish the video here. The remaining data sheets that I have available will be posted and cycled through, and as I mentioned, the timestamps will be in the description below if you need to skip forward to look for anything in particular. So if you liked the video, please leave a thumbs up. If you didn't like the video, put a thumbs down. Leave any comments with questions, point out any mistakes I made, any suggestions for improving the content, and if you want, give me a subscribe. I aim to bring out content at least once a week, sometimes twice. And as ever, stay safe, healthy, and kill main burn.